Conceiving the Future, Pronatalism, Reproduction, and the Family in the United States, critically examined pronatalist eugenics policies in the US from irrigation to housing policies. Her second book, co-edited with Lori Rotskoff, When We Were Free to Be, looking back at a children's classic and the difference it made, was the first critical examination of one of the most important texts of the US women's movement. She is the founding co-editor of the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth and currently serves as a deputy editor for North American for the Women's History Review. She is currently co-editing its Our Movement Now, Black Women's Politics and the 1977 National Women's Conference with Rachel Jessica Daniel and Kelly N. Giles, a collection of 17 essays by scholars of the African American feminists who helped organize and lead the first National Women's Conference in 1977. And she is here today to chat with us about the 1918 flu epidemic, specifically around Pittsburgh. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Laura Lovett. She has a PowerPoint. We're working to get that PowerPoint on the screen, so please just bear with us. But in the meantime, Dr. Laura Lovett is going to start her presentation.
Okay, it says I'm sharing my video, but I don't see it.
We don't see your face for some reason. It's black right now. The screen is black.
It says I'm sharing the video. Is it not coming through? But you can hear me.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
All right. Well, I think you're gonna get to hear me for a second. Well, we're still working on the PowerPoint. So let me just start by thanking you for bringing me into this and to tell you what a great treat it was to read Thomas Mullen's book. He did a fabulous job, I thought, with especially a lot of the history, especially around the Wobblies and the politics. He was working at a time before we had really given a lot of critical thinking to the history of the 1918 epidemic, influenza epidemic. And I think since COVID, of course, we know a lot more about this. We are still working on the PowerPoint, but what I wanted to do was to go back and I'll sort of talk you through, and then if I get my PowerPoint up, I'll get to show it to you. And hopefully I can show you myself as well. Oh, I know why. There, now you can see me, right? Am I in?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, you can see me, yay. That's what happens when okay, good. So at least we've got one part of it working. We're working on the rest. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the fact that, one of the issues with especially the epidemic is the COVID epidemic is that it puts us much more in relationship to the history of most of human history, in terms of the fact that we're much more inclined to deal with epidemics. And it was just a much more common experience in human history. It's only something that's changed literally in the last 115 years. And so I had begun by framing a little bit of a conversation around, for example, the smallpox epidemic, even this sort of effort. I don't know if any of you know this, but Pittsburgh is the only cited place in North America where we have documented use of germ warfare in the 1765-63 Pontiac's war. Colonel Henry Bouquet, who helped to, I think I've got my PowerPoint.
Do you have permission to share on this login?
Do I have permission to share?
Yes.
Yes. So can you see it?
Does Laura, does the person logged in as Laura have permission to share?
Yes. If you go down to the bottom of the screen, there's a box with an arrow.
Yeah.
Click on that and then click share files, or you can share screen.
Sorry, we're working on this. Please.
It's not,
Is it coming up? No.
it's just not sharing.
Okay, it's not going to let me share.
Sorry.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you, if you're okay with it, I will send you, especially the PowerPoint slides that I made that are about Beaver County in particular. I went through some of the archival material on Beaver County to talk about the history of, especially the epidemic there. But I started my class because I recently moved to Pittsburgh from Amherst, where the decision was made to change the name of Amherst College's mascot from the Lord Jeff, named for Lord Jeffrey Amherst, because Lord Jeffrey Amherst was the recipient of the letter by Colonel Henry Bouquet, who suggested using the smallpox blankets that had been distributed from Fort Pitt in the 1763 Indian War with the a lot of the Delaware and the tribes in the region that were really upset at the British response at the end of the 7 Years' War. And so one of the things that I'm interested in that, because especially where the town I came from tried to change the name of not only the school mascot, but there was actually a proposal to change the name of the town. And it was because of the recipient of this letter. I teach in a department, the Department of History at Pitt, which is located on Bouquet Street, named for Henry Bouquet. But that was, I think I also began, I wanted to discuss, just to give you a sense of kind of the long version of this issue of epidemics. Some of you may be familiar with John Edgar Wideman, who grew up in Homewood in Pittsburgh, actually, who was, one of the first African-American Rhodes Scholars, a renowned fiction writer, who wrote a book that included a short story based on the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. And part of the reason I wanted to include that is that he addresses Matthew Carey, who wrote this kind of narrative that we have about the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. He addresses like an answer to that piece that was put together by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, two African American who were forced during that epidemic. And part of this, I think, connects to the kind of larger narrative of the way in which epidemics often reflect different experiences and different connections in terms of resources. During the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, the perception was that, and this is the way Carey put it, African Americans were not affected by the disease. And so, in fact, they were forced actually to be the individuals who removed the bodies from the city during the epidemic. And Absalom Jones and Frederick Allen wrote an account of that epidemic many years later that said, as they said it, the public were informed in the West that in the West Indies and other places that this terrible malady had been. It was observed that blacks were not affected with it. Happy would it have been for you, and much more happy for us, if this observation had been verified by our experience. And what Wideman does in his novel about the 1763 epidemic is he actually kind of, in the same way that Thomas Mullen takes the historical narrative of an epidemic and uses fiction to talk about that, he does this in his narrative. One of the things that he really kind of frames especially is the way in which somebody like Alexander Hamilton actually blamed the yellow fever epidemic on French refugees who had fled the Haitian Revolution just a year or two before, as the source of the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. So you can see a kind of legacy, I think, especially in terms of the impetus towards scapegoating around epidemics. You can see the legacy in terms of the perception of different resources and different races, and kind of different things around an epidemic. More pertinent, I think, to thinking about the 1918 epidemic, I think, are the epidemics that swept through Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh area in particular. From really around 1900 to about 1915, there were 3 epidemics of typhoid. And one of the pieces I would love to share with you is an article that talks about the way in which the typhoid epidemic of 1903 profoundly affected the county of Butler County, with 1,600 people. And typhoid is not an epidemic, it's a waterborne illness. But at the time, they didn't quite know what was causing it. And they didn't understand the relationship between these sort of masses of waves of response and the epidemic itself. And so, in fact, at the time that the typhoid epidemic is going through Pittsburgh, on average, about 253 deaths per 100,000 are from influenza or from typhoid are fairly normal. That will be almost tripled during the 1918 epidemic, averaging around between 757 deaths per 100,000. And so you have, it's not tripled, it's more, it's like 2.5. So what I want you to get a sense of is at the time of the 1918 flu, right, there is already a kind of level of tolerance and understanding of people who are going to be affected by the epidemic. And so with that in place, one of the things I want to talk about is the epidemic itself. I want to talk generally about it, and then I want to talk specifically about it in Pittsburgh, and then actually I'm going to talk about it in Beaver County as well. So the first wave of the influenza is actually called the Spanish flu because wartime censors did not allow information about the flu to be distributed. The first reported headlines then of this deadly virus appeared in the Spanish press in Madrid. Spain had remained neutral during the war. It was one of the countries that was not going to be involved in this international war. And so they did not censor their press. And so they didn't feel the need to kind of quell the conversation around what was happening. And you saw some reference to that in the Mullen book. He talks about the kind of lack of information and the way in which people are struggling to understand what's happening. That is absolutely because as this infection is flying around the world, and it winds up infecting something like 40% of the world's population, killing an estimated 50 to 100 million people by the time it ends. By the time it ends, they think that it's killed almost 3 times as many people as die from the war itself. It begins, even though the novel frames it as, you know, the narrative around the epidemic suggests that it begins in Germany, or one of the rumors suggests that it does. Where we think it begins is actually in Fort Riley, Kansas. We have the first identification of an illness, a flu-like illness breaking out in Fort Riley in March of 1918. By April 5th of 1918, you have the first official mentioning of influenza, and they don't call it influenza. They consistently, especially in the, you'll notice in the press and in the material, they talk about it as pneumonia, flu. They're afraid to kind of name it as a influenza especially. But nevertheless, you get a public health report in that first week of April that reports 3 deaths and 18 cases in Fort Haskell, Kansas. By the next month after that, in May of 1918, you have thousands and thousands, and literally eventually hundreds of thousands of draftees who had begun. We'd initiated the first draft in 1917, and they begin to deploy to Europe. And when they go to Europe, right, so that first wave happens in what we know in the US, and then travels. But by the time it travels, where they're going, they're on crowded troop ships. They wind up in trenches. Some of you may know the origin of trench coats, right? Trench coats were the kinds of things that you wore to live in the mud and muck of the trenches, which were filled with vermin, with water, with all sorts of conditions that are absolutely conducive to creating a hot pot of spreading what we now know was the virus H1N1. There are a number of different H's and N's versions of it, but we think we've taken it back to H1N1. If you haven't seen it, one of the things I recommend is Peter Jackson's colorized film of the First World War, They Shall Not Grow Old. He uses a film made by the Imperial War Museum, and you really get the sense of how horrific the conditions were and how likely they would be to spread that kind of disease. So in the United States, you still have this kind of continuation of life as normal, including in early April, right? So after the epidemic has begun to take root in the troops and in the camps, there was an event in Pittsburgh at the Syria Mosque that drew 4,000 people. In this case, it was a talk by Colonel Roscoe Simmons, who was Booker T. Washington's nephew, who gives a patriotic narrative about the experience of African Americans if they will just join in the fight for the war. So it's a recruiting effort. And you have the continuation of that kind of event. And so what I want to give you is a little bit of a context for what happens with what we know is the most deadly part of the influenza epidemic, which is the second wave, right? So the first wave is fairly deadly, but it is not what happens afterward. So the second wave, by the time there's a kind of, it circulated around in the fall of 1918. So between the spring and the fall, you have kind of a re-establishment of diseases and resources. And so by 1918, in early September of 1918, outside of Boston, at a military camp called Camp Devens, you begin to get kind of a second and much more virulent form of the flu, something that kills people within almost a day, maybe 2 days of them showing symptoms. And in fact, in response to that, early September, on September 5th, in 1918, the Massachusetts Department of Health warns people, and their warning goes something like, you know, if you're suffering with colds, you should avoid crowds, right? So there's a kind of understanding that, in fact, the nexus of this disease spread is crowding, but it really doesn't take off until September, late September into November. And what we know is that most of the deaths of the 1918 epidemic occur in that second wave from September to November, including most notoriously, and the way in which, if you've heard much about the epidemic, you've heard about Philadelphia. It is actually more virulent in Pittsburgh. More people die in Pittsburgh than die in Philadelphia. We have a kind of focus on Philadelphia, I think, because of the history of the medical studies in Philadelphia, but also because on September 28th in 1918, Philadelphia hosted what was the largest parade in the history of the city, with something like 200,000 people attending a Liberty Loan Drive in Philadelphia. And within just 10 days of that event, you have thousands and thousands of Philadelphians who wind up dying. Between September, that event on the circulating before then. Sometimes some people actually think around September 14th, it starts in the Navy Yards and moves to the city of Philadelphia. So by the time they're hosting that large parade at the end of September, it's just a measure of a way to really spread the disease. According to, and so total, the number of deaths in Philadelphia is something like 15,500. That compares to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a third the size of Philadelphia at the time, and 16,000 people. So even more people died, and they died in a shorter time period between October and November of 1918. The studies for this are all taken there. It's random in terms of figuring out the statistics. They're collected by the Department of the Navy. That's because until really 1918, we don't have a standing army. We do have a Navy because we're actually and actively, and have been since really the 1890s, kind of using our Navy to acquire both commercial and imperial acquisitions and connections. But we won't create a kind of standing army until after that First World War. By October 4th, so in light of that event in Philadelphia, by October 4th, the state of Pennsylvania Health Department issues recommended gathering bans. They suggest that saloons be closed, theaters, motion picture houses, places of entertainment, but they don't recommend closing schools. However, Philadelphia decides that what they will do is they will close down schools, they'll close down any kind of public event. They can see the virulence of the flu and what it's doing. And so they react in a way that really tries to protect their population. At the time, Pittsburgh is imagining that they are immune to this situation. And they do that in part because where Philadelphia had this huge parade on September 28th, on September 29th at Forbes Field, Mayor Babcock hosted an event to raise funds to raise money for Liberty loans at Forbes Field that brought in 40,000 people. And where within a couple of days in Philadelphia, and keep in mind, because Philadelphia is the place where all these troops are shipping out and where you have the Navy Yards and sort of lots more camps, where the war production is more rooted in Pittsburgh, they have a kind of a massive epidemic. In light of that, Pittsburgh actually decides to send its nurses, its doctors, the University of Pittsburgh, at the time it's Western, I think it's Western, maybe it's not, maybe it's Pitt, decides to send their medical students, their nursing students, everyone is sent who is able to, is sent to Philadelphia. And in fact, the papers talk about Pittsburgh health authorities declare that if Pittsburgh gets the flu, it's going to get the less serious Boston type of flu that had circulated earlier, not the Philadelphia strain. So there's this sense that in fact, they are immune to it. When the governor calls for quarantine, the Pittsburgh paper announces that in fact Pittsburgh will be under quarantine. But the headline actually, and I will send this along to you, says that there are fewer cases here. Southwestern Pennsylvania has escaped the serious outbreak so far. Right? So there's this sense that in fact, it's Philadelphia's problem, it's not Pittsburgh. That is a really ridiculous perspective. And it's especially ridiculous, as I mentioned before, Pittsburgh has this legacy of kind of people responding to the flu in a much more virulent way. And part of that is because of the nature of the industry in Pittsburgh. In 1907, if you haven't seen this, I will send a link to this as well. The Pittsburgh Survey becomes the first comprehensive study of a city. It really launches social science research. Any of you who are thinking of majoring in what I call ology majors, biology, sociology, physiology, anthropology, all of those ology majors are rooted in the progressive era interest in statistical study. And in fact, the Pittsburgh Survey is the first massive study by a series of professionals and scientists who are going to look at the impact in the community of the industry. It's the first major sociological study of a community undertaken by experts. And what they call attention to are the horrible, horrible living conditions. Crystal Eastman, who focuses on health and work accidents and the law in the Pittsburgh Survey, writes about the number of deaths that happened in Pittsburgh, something like a death a day, at least at some of the mills, and even more. What that means, and this is part of the reason that in fact people pay attention to Philadelphia and not to Pittsburgh, is that Pittsburgh actually has the infrastructure in place for lots of burials. Philadelphia doesn't. And so when Philadelphia gets this virulent outbreak, they actually talk about the bodies that are dumped on the street corners and are stocked in temporary locations, not unlike the coolers that we had to use during COVID. And so you have a kind of infrastructure in Pittsburgh that's already ready to address death. You don't have the resources to address the hospitals and the situation because we've sent our medical personnel, and then you have, and as with COVID, so too with influenza, you have the kind of conditions. There are more than 30 mills that are running at the time. The conditions in Pittsburgh are so horrific in terms of ash and soot in the air that almost everyone has some kind of respiratory struggle. If you can see, I'm wearing a white shirt. In Pittsburgh at the time was called a two-shirt town. Do people know what that means? I don't know if anyone knows what that means, but what it meant was if you were wearing a white shirt, it would no longer be white by noon. And so if you were, let's say, a banker who was somebody who was supposed to have, or a mill owner, not a mill worker, a mill owner who was supposed to present yourself in terms of your status, in terms of your clean clothing, you had to literally take 2 shirts with you and change at noon, because the first one would be pitch black by the middle of the day. And so you've got the conditions in Pittsburgh that mean that people are going to be struggling around any kind of respiratory disease. And it's not literally until, so in fact, when the governor in October suggests that in fact people ought to start not attending large events, and they should identify emergency supplies and hospital sites, the mayor in Pittsburgh is convinced that he absolutely does not need to. And in fact, you won't have any kind of response in Pittsburgh until October 8th to the 12th, right? So within 3-4 weeks after probably the introduction of the virulent strain in Philadelphia, you begin to have the recognition in Pittsburgh that in fact maybe they ought to respond to it. And so you have health officials who begin to start looking for, can we create extra hospital sites? Can we open up places? There's an article that I will share as well that talks about Camp Sherman in Chillicothe, which I think is in near Western PA, that talks about the pneumonia cases that continue to develop. And this is on that October 8th date, and it says, although the increase is not as great as previous reports have shown, practically no new cases of influenza, and the pneumonia cases developing are among soldiers taken ill with influenza several years ago. So they're not able to figure out the relationship between kind of the way in which the lungs would have filled with fluid as in what they understood to be pneumonia, and the relationship between that and the influenza. And so what that means is there's a real delayed reaction in the city of Pittsburgh. In fact, the Pittsburgh public schools remain open until the end of October, where parochial schools actually begin shutting down at the beginning of of October. So you literally have a month between, and part of that I think is that the parochial schools actually recognize a lot of the nursing students and the nurses are connected to some of the religious institutions, and they're nuns, and so they recognize. I think they're in the trenches, and they realize kind of the nature of this situation. Whereas the mayor of Pittsburgh and his public health director advises him to begin monitoring the rates of sickness and death in school children as a way of understanding the situation throughout the city. I don't know how you all handled the assessment of cases of COVID, but I know at Pitt, one of the things that we did was exactly that kind of thing. We were doing kind of studies, random testing last year as a way of gauging how widespread the disease is. It's one thing if you've got a disease that takes a week to develop, and it's another thing if it takes 2 days. Right, so they're actually just they're trying to figure out a way to address the situation, and basically they decide we're not going to worry about it. It's not going to. We're going to have the Boston strain, not the Philadelphia strain, and so they're really ill-equipped when in fact it turns out to be really horrific. It begins to spread as well, so that in the counties that are next to Pittsburgh, where you also have mills, you have, for example, a discussion on October 9th of 2 men in the same Butler house dying. And in fact, Beaver Falls in November, health officials intimate that schools and public halls ought to be closed. So in fact, there is the sense that in fact it's not going to affect the rural places in the way that it affects the urban places. And so you get this kind of lag behind the reaction to it. So there is a third strain. It goes through. It looks like kind of the virulent strain that goes through in 1918. And if any of you get a chance, one of the ways that I encourage my students to really think about the history of something like this is to go through a cemetery and to look at the headstones and to look at the dates on the headstones. You can actually mark epidemics. In winter and spring of 1919, in response to the armistice, you have a kind of it's not unlike our reaction to COVID during the summer here, when everyone felt like we've got the vaccine, we're ready to go out, we're ready to get back to normal. They had the same response in reaction, especially to the armistice in November of 1919. And what that means is between that and the returning troops who are coming back from Europe and coming back on incredibly crowded vessels, that you have a third wave that goes through between winter and spring of 1919. So it literally sort of circles in terms of a series of waves. And so there are a couple of takeaway points that I just wanted to make about the epidemic. I've done a little bit of work, and I'm happy to talk if people are interested in, I was looking for a commune-like town, a town that was interested in sort of challenging the economic structure. And of course, Beaver County's own economy, which is a little bit earlier. It's founded in the early 19th century. But it didn't pop up in any of the discussion around the First World War. I think that's because by the time that First World War comes around, this colony, which had really decided that it would be celibate, like not unlike the Shakers, had aged into a place where it wasn't actively kind of organizing against the war. But Mullen makes his story about the town that had decided to to close down. And that was a town called Gunnison, Colorado, which in a little report about it in the newspaper at the time, described it as the freest from the Spanish influenza of any point in the state. At that time, right, the way in which their version of what he calls a reverse quarantine worked was that anybody who was ill, their house was immediately quarantined. It was fumigated. Strangers were not allowed to remain overnight in Gunnison. And but it wasn't necessarily kind of shut off, and guns weren't pointed at people who tried to come in. There was an interesting perception, and this connects to kind of what happens with the repeated wave, is that they understood the role of masks and they recommended them. But people always imagined, and this connects to this idea about who they thought would infect them, masks were something you used in public. But if you went into, let's say you went to dinner at a friend's house, or you were in a boarding house or something, even though you might be dealing with people who would have lots of connections, people would remove their masks as well. So just a couple of takeaways from this situation, and in terms of similarities between 1918 and 2020. We saw the same kind of shortage of healthcare workers. The supply in terms of issues of resources at the time in 1918 was exacerbated by wartime rationing and even more serious shortages. We saw scapegoating. There were no central mandates. There was no federal mandate. And where there were mandates, there was resistance to the mandates, as you could see with Pittsburgh's decision to flout Harrisburg's recommendation that they really shut down in early October, and they didn't. There were appeals to patriotism and what it meant to mask and to go without on behalf of the good of the whole. You began to see a sharpening of political differences as well. One of the real takeaways from this was that women who had served, as they do with the Second World War, they served in the First World War to help mobilize. They were doing sort of lots of factory work and agricultural work. It meant they performed important jobs for the country during the war, but that especially became true during the epidemic. And they often served in military medical positions in medical corps, which become especially important as those waves of the epidemics move through the military, especially. And so as a result of that, they actually really feel like the calls that they've been making towards suffrage, that they really have a right to do it. A recent Smithsonian magazine talked about the way in which the 1918 epidemic advanced women's rights by noting that the virus disproportionately affected young men and young women who had stepped into more public roles. Women stepped into public roles that had previously not been open to them, and that helped to secure the concession about their need to have political representation. And we also see the similarity in terms of waves of infection and waves of celebratory release. I'm going to stop there, and I really wish I could share my screen. What I'll do is I'll work out with Stacy Freeman what would be helpful to you for either thinking about the novel or researching it. I went and found a number of kind of material objects that are newspaper articles that talk about especially Beaver and Beaver Falls and Beaver County and Pittsburgh. And so I would love to get those to you in some capacity. But let me stop right there and see if you have any questions.
And any materials that you share with me, I will certainly share with the college community here. So thank you for that. And thank you for your presentation as well. So now if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or you can simply turn on your microphones.
I don't think I can see people. So maybe I can. Okay, I'm going to put it on that gallery view. but I think I can see questions. So maybe I can ask you, was there anything surprising in Mullen's book, or anything anyone wants to get more information about? I'm more than happy to talk about any aspect of it that I can.
You mentioned during your presentation the view of the epidemic and in terms of African Americans.
Sure.
Can you reiterate that information again? And is there any, in the book itself, there seemed to be a sort of absence of African American characters. Can you reflect on that in the book as well?
Well, I think the absence is the location that he set it in. He set it in the Pacific Northwest. And in fact, there were laws in, I think in Oregon, that actually proscribed anyone who was African American from settling in certain areas, right? So it's a very white part of the country. What he doesn't talk about, and what's surprising is an omission, and this may be, I'm not sure he's in the Pacific Northwest, but there are a lot of indigenous people that are still present in that time period. They may not be present in tribal affiliation, but they are still there. And so that's kind of the surprising omission. In Pittsburgh, we had a fairly large percentage of African Americans, and unfortunately, because of the nature of mill work, they wound up often in the hardest and the most kind of polluted areas in terms of their work positions. And then the Hill District in Pittsburgh was a place where it's up above kind of a lot of and it's literally the first hill after a lot of the rivers, the mills on the river. And so that district in particular would have been particularly fraught. One of the things I talk about in one of the things I discovered in my work was actually because Pittsburgh is a center for African American organizing, especially, and so where Roscoe Simmons, who's comes to kind of do a kind of big push to get African Americans to join the military. When they join the military, what they're expected to do is to serve in service roles. And you had a series of African American men who were at pharmacy school at Pitt and at CMU, and a number of high school students who are educated, who graduate, who begin to organize. And in fact, it's two Pitt pharmacy students, African American pharmacy students, who push to make sure that when African Americans join the military during the First World War, they actually create the first artillery company of African Americans. And so they managed to mobilize, the 4,000 people who turn out to hear this talk gives you some sense of how big a community it is. Nevertheless, right, there's a differential impact in terms of where people are able to access healthcare and where healthcare is located. So they actually have to open up an emergency hospital in the Hill District to address kind of the levels of disease in that community. It's one of the few that they actually organize it better and faster than than they do. They try to do an emergency hospital at McGee's as well, and it's a little more cumbersome in terms of how they set it up. But the influenza committee of the Red Cross, for example, adds on hospitals in the county courthouse, in what's called the Kingsley House, which is in the African American community. There's a emergency hospital created in Washington Park, right? So they're really trying to kind of figure out how to manage it. And part of the issue is the susceptibility, because of the Hill District at the time is actually mixed. It's going to be African American and also especially a lot of newer Jewish immigrants. And so, but it tends to be people who are working in the mills and working class. Does that answer the question?
It did, thank you. And another a sort of follow-up question of sorts. With the current pandemic and the 1918 epidemic, are there glaring similarities? I mean, you know the history of the epidemic. Do you see similarities between the two? And if so, what are the most sort of glaring similarities?
So if I can just follow up a little bit on that, the previous question on that, in that piece, what we find with COVID is an increasing difference in terms of healthcare access and resource access. And part of that is the impact of the post-World War II segregation that happens as a result of redlining and HOLC funding. So we were a little bit less segregated in the First World War than we are in terms of racial segregation in the second and in the current moment. And I think that has a kind of more isolating effect in terms of access to resources and access to information and access to sort of, initially when we were distributing the vaccine, for example. I do see there is, I think the glaring similarities are the similarity in that what we know worked, right? Works again, right? It's about isolating, using masks, washing your hands, being the same kind of measures, but at the same time, we see the same kind of resistance to it depending on the locale and depending on what kind of information people are getting. A lot of times people think right now we're in this moment when you get really divided news and different news streams, and that's actually more similar to the way in which newspapers, for example, worked in the 19th and into the early 20th century, right? There was a kind of you would get pockets of news, and a lot of times the newspaper was published by with one very explicit political agenda or political event, and that would be what you would read. So we imagine that this notion that we're kind of getting different information is new, but in fact it wasn't. I think the difference was that in the time period in 1914, 1915, 1918, there's a real sense of change, right? The progressive era means that there are lots of kind of new ideas around science that are circulating and lots of investment in thinking about them. And so, so you have kind of more people interested in thinking about public health and in learning about what to do. That's why you get these fields like sociology and anthropology and physiology, and you also have a kind of a vision around using kind of structures to implement programs. That's why, for example, you get more of a difference between the parochial schools and the public schools, because the role of the parishes and the church in terms of resources means that there's a kind of a more of a overall what we'd think of as almost a welfare state kind of relationship between that institution and its community. We have shifted our idea a bit. And I think we haven't necessarily shifted our understanding of what a state should or can do. I think we're kind of in between the two. We're looking back toward this moment of no centralized measures, but we don't have the infrastructure that they would have had during that time when there weren't centralized measures, but there were different institutions like the Red Cross or the YWCA or the local parish church, right? That would have given you a much more, I think, comprehensive set of resources. You can see that in the town in Commonwealth, which is named, right, kind of for the whole, but everything is going to be available to the workers through the town itself, right? And at the time, I think Charles is imagining that if he can just set up a bank, right, he will have everything there. So the workers have their housing, they have their food, they have their education, and they'll have kind of their finance and resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Any other questions?
So I'm really sorry about the PowerPoint failure. If you have any questions, if something comes up, if you email me, Stacy has my email. I will be happy to answer it. If you'll just stick a memo in it that says, you know, last town on earth or question about last town on earth, I will be happy to answer.
And as I said, I'll definitely share out your PowerPoint when I have access
Yeah.
to it. I'm sure it has a wealth of information, but you did a wonderful job regardless of the tech issues. Thank you so much, Dr. Lovett.
Thank you so much too, and I'm really sorry, but we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. Thank you.
Sure
And thank
thing.
you for everyone for joining us today. You're welcome to stay a few minutes if you have a question for Dr. Lovett. Yes, this presentation is being recorded. This presentation is being recorded. As soon as I have access to the recording, I'll send it out to everyone who wants it.
Thank you.
Are you able to see the chat, Dr.
I do. I appreciate this. I'm really sorry.
It's not a big deal. Sometimes tech just gets the better of us, but I'm sure you said the file was really large, so I think that's probably part of the issue.
Yeah. I just am not used. I never take tech for granted, and you think I would have known to not do it this time, but. Yeah. So this is a common read, so everyone's read it?
Let me stop the recording. Hold on one second. I completely forgot.